Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/UNC Knowledge. Twitter.com/UNC Knowledge. John Yoo is a professor of law at the University of California at Berkeley and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. From 2001 to 2003, he served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department of President George W. Bush. Professor Yoo is the author of a number of books, most recently of Crisis and Command, A History of Executive Power from George Washington to George W. Bush. John, we'll come back to this subject, as we must, but right now, briefly at the top of our conversation, 2 years in the Bush White House that proved intensely controversial. Do you regret any aspect of it?
No, I don't.
All right. Thank you. Segment 1, Crisis and Command. Let's deal with command. I'm quoting from your book, John. When the delegates to the Constitutional Convention met in the summer of 1787, the only thing that made them more uncomfortable than the Philadelphia heat was the topic of the executive. How come?
Well, it's commonly said, which is true, that the colonists rebelled against England because they were upset with King George III. And so people commonly think, oh, well, that must mean the Constitution is an anti-executive document. But it wasn't, because in the period between the Revolution and the writing of our Constitution, our states enacted these terrible state constitutions that tried to weaken the executive. The most famous example comes from my original home state, Pennsylvania, which had 12-member governorships, with each of those 12 people re-elected annually. Trying to destroy executive power by weakening it, making it non-unitary, and making it subject. They were all elected by the legislature.
There's a kind of lingering example of that in New Hampshire, where there's a governor, but who has to submit to a governor's council, as I recall.
Yes,
anyway,
yes, exactly. A number of states still have these governor's councils in addition,
right. Mm-hmm.
which are kind of like a superpowered Senate and have to give their advice and consent to a lot of the governor's decisions. And a lot of those people are not accountable to the governor. And so at the time of Philadelphia in 1787, the people who came, the delegates, to write the Constitution weren't reacting against King George anymore. They were reacting against all the problems in the states, and especially one of those being the fragmentation, the weakening of the executive. But at the same time, they didn't want to put a monarchy back in place either. So they had to undertake this new thing, which was how to create a Republican executive.
So they had before them two negative models. The very strong executive of the King of England acting through his, in those days, quite a tight relationship between the king and the ministry, and a weak executive in a number of states which had enacted something like that. It just didn't work.
Exactly.
So they had no positive model. Is that roughly?
They had, the only real example they had to follow was the governor of New York, who had been very successful. And many people, including Alexander Hamilton, thought of, who himself was from New York, thought of the governor of New York as being kind of a model. The governor of New York was independently elected. He wasn't chosen by the legislature, and he wielded very broad powers, especially since the state of New York and the city of New York were occupied for most of the Revolutionary War itself. So the governor, a fellow named, oddly enough, Clinton, Governor Clinton, was a very admired but very activist governor. So that was the only real model they had of a successful Republican executive.
And that's more or less what they end up with. Article 2 gives us a president who is independent of both the judiciary and the legislature, and who's elected by all the people.
Right.
Okay, so let me quote again, Crisis and Command. The executive power had been established, you're talking about the Constitutional Convention, so as to allow future occupants of presidency to claim inherent authorities, among them the conduct of foreign policy and the protection of the national security, close quote. I feel the impulse to say, now you're sure of that, Professor Yoo, because so much of the rest of the document is occupied with carefully enumerating powers. Yet you're saying that in Article 2, you've got inherent powers, and that's the way they wanted it.
Well, first, let me compliment you on being a close reader of the Constitution. You've got a good grasp of its text.
Well.
Most of the I don't know if that would get you an A at Berkeley, but it would at Stanford. So, so most of the document,
fighting words,
most of the document, when it talks about Congress, is a careful list of the powers of the legislature, some of which, Congress, I would think today actually has gone beyond. But nonetheless, it has careful list. And compare that to the executive, where the executive power is just granted to the president without a list of what it means. So the listing of Congress says the powers herein listed essentially are granted to Congress. But with Article 2, as you mentioned, it just says the executive power is given to the president, but it's not carefully defined the way it is with Congress's powers. And so two things I try to do is, one, what did executives at the time do? What were their powers? The second is, clearly this is meant to be somewhat elastic, and particularly meant to be elastic in response to challenges, emergencies, crisis, and ultimately war.
And that, John Yoo, is where I thought to myself, I cannot believe what I'm reading. John Yoo is subscribing to the doctrine of the living Constitution.
Well, when the framers wanted a part of the Constitution to be flexible, I think we have to honor that original intention. I don't think the framers wanted every part of the Constitution necessarily to be frozen. Let me also say, though, they didn't think it would be a one-way ratchet. They didn't think the president's powers would grow and then just stay there. I think the president's powers were meant to fluctuate, expand during emergencies, and then during peacetime would retract back to a smaller state, which is, I think, the way the presidency has operated for most of our history.